The war between Ukraine and Russia continues fiercely on strategic front lines such as Zaporizhia, Melitopol, Tokmak, Kherson, Berdyansk, and of course, Crimea. Especially in the last days, the incredible advance of the Ukrainians in the Zaporizhia Oblast has affected Crimea, one of the most important front lines of the war. The main aim of the Ukrainians is to liberate Crimea from the Russians by achieving success on the southern front lines. Therefore, the Ukrainian forces are currently continuing their offensive operations in and around Zaporizhia without stopping. With the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam, the trenches of the Russian troops in Kherson were flooded, thus eliminating the possibility of the Ukrainians encountering any dangerous Russian attack in this region. Therefore, Ukrainian troops are making serious efforts these days to neutralize the Kerch Bridge, one of the most strategic centers connecting Crimea and Russia, and to build an attack corridor on the peninsula from Ukrainian territory. Not only Ukrainian forces undertake these efforts, but also Ukrainian partisan groups that support Kiev and are against the regime of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. If you recall, the most recent Ukrainian partisan groups conducted a critical offensive operation to create an offensive corridor between Crimea and Ukrainian territory and cut off Russia's connection to the peninsula and the southern Ukrainian front lines. For these purposes, Ukrainian partisans blew up the railway bridge near Melitopol in the settlement of Yakimivka in the temporarily occupied part of the Zaporizhia region. Local partisans neutralized a railway bridge that the invaders were using to supply weapons from Crimea, leaving Moscow in a desperate position for military supplies, especially as the unexpected advances of Ukrainian troops in Zaporizhia continued. Such an action plan put Russia in a helpless position on the southern front lines. But the most resounding actions of Ukrainian partisans took place in the past few days. Explosions on a major railway line connecting Russian troops in mainland Ukraine to occupied Crimea have greatly worried residents and Russian officials there. Russian telegram channel Basar reported that an explosion occurred on the railway while a freight train was traveling on the tracks in Crimea. The explosion occurred right next to the train, traveling in the lane between Vladislavovka and Kirovskaya. The train conductor braked quickly, glass shattered from the blast wave in the cockpit, but the conductor himself was not injured. Telegram channel 112 reported that 2 train personnel were injured by glass shards, although they were not hospitalized. Sergei Aksionov, the Kremlin-appointed governor of Crimea, reported that rail traffic was suspended following the damage to the railroad tracks. This dramatic act of attack on one of the most important railways in Crimea seriously damaged the Russian military supply lines. And the suspension of rail traffic critically prevented Moscow from sending aid from Crimea to the southern Ukrainian front lines. Therefore, the Ukrainian forces were much more relieved in these front lines as the Russian troops were deprived of military resources. In addition, this striking act of aggression was an important factor in the evacuation of the Russian authorities and their relatives in Crimea. It was already known that the ongoing Ukrainian attacks in Zaporizhia would also affect Crimea when the time came. However, it was not expected that the attacks of the Ukrainians targeting both Zaporizhia and Crimea would be so effective in such a short time. For this reason, the residents of the Crimea region and the Russian authorities on the peninsula, their families, and relatives accelerated their preparations to go to much safer areas. This latest explosion on the Crimean railway was described as the last warning for the inhabitants of the peninsula. Ukrainian officials declined to comment on reports of railroad explosions on the peninsula. However, Ukrainian partisan forces operating independently in the occupied Crimea and the southern regions of Ukraine did not hesitate to take responsibility for this attack. Attash's Telegram account, which claimed responsibility for a number of partisan actions, including the bombing of Russian military assets in Crimea and attacks on Russian-appointed administration officials, shared the details of the train attack between Vladislavovka and Kirovskaya. In the joint statement published by the attack group, it was emphasized that success can only be achieved by uniting. It was also among the data in the declaration that the efforts of the Ukrainian partisan movement will continue to destroy the pro-war Russian forces in the peninsula and seek collaboration. The division of Ukrainian partisan groups into 3 was among the critical data in the joint statement. These were known as Attack Berdyansk Partisans and Mariupol Resistance. Little is known about the structure, size, or scope of the 3 Ukrainian partisan groups mentioned, and Ukrainian authorities did not share much information about them. There is only one thing that is known about these groups, and that is their common goal is the liberation of Ukraine. However, reports of partisan activities in occupied Crimea and southern Ukraine are a matter of public record. It has become a common warfare tactic for partisans to turn to shaping movements, often before more conventional attacks by regular Ukrainian military forces, especially before the offensive operations of the Ukrainian army on the front lines of Crimea and southern Ukraine. We witness the resounding actions of partisan groups. These actions often include confirmed bombings, arson and sabotage, attacks against energy pipelines, refineries, storage facilities, rail lines, and transit hubs on these front lines, namely areas covering Crimea and southern Ukraine. In addition, partisan groups also carry out actions against the concentration of Russian troops on the same fronts in barracks, military-industrial complex sites, and ammunition dumps. Other shaping activities of Ukrainian partisan groups are developing mostly in the field of intelligence. As you know, Ukrainian forces have successfully conducted long-range strikes of airborne weapons on both the Crimean and southern front lines, including the UK Storm Shadow missiles and other Allied-supplied missiles. Presumably, target identification data on these missile strikes was previously provided by Ukrainian partisans. In other words, partisan groups, in addition to operating in operational areas, also provide important intelligence data to the Ukrainian army. Another important part of partisan activity was the expulsion of people who participated in Russian administrations in the occupied Ukrainian territory. It is known that since the beginning of the large-scale invasion, about 80 Russian officials considered collaborators have been disqualified or injured by partisan forces by car bombings, small arms fire, or other means with handmade explosive devices. Partisans in the occupied territories also took part in psychological operations, including information distribution, digital campaigning, graffiti, and related efforts, as well as intelligence gathering and transmission to Ukrainian authorities. For example, as Ukrainian forces advanced to liberate Kherson, resistance fighters conducted frontal strikes and provided reconnaissance for regular troops. Ukrainian partisans recently posted photos of a group of Russian soldiers on their Telegram channel with a slogan, "We are watching you." In addition, partisan groups bravely hung banners on critical front lines such as Kherson, Melitopol, and Berdyansk saying, "If HIMARS can't reach you, a partisan will." This situation was not taken into account by the Russians. Yes, partisans don't usually win battles, but they have the capacity to damage logistics and infrastructure behind the lines and logistics infrastructure. Our concepts are vital to winning a war. That's why the Ukrainian government has openly facilitated partisan activities not only with firearms, but also with platforms such as Telegram channels and websites to encourage and instruct partisans. The National Center for the Resistance of Ukraine has published several guides on how to use drones, how to confiscate Russian tanks, and how to manufacture improvised weapons such as Molotov cocktails. In addition, the National Resistance Center has given some powers and roles to the Special Operations Forces by Ukraine. These included critical actions such as training, coordinating, and scaling movements against the occupation of Ukraine, teaching nonviolent resistance, assisting partisans, gathering information on Russian forces, and establishing underground communications, and informing the people of Ukraine about the events in the temporarily occupied territory was among the roles and powers given. In a nutshell, this is how the Ukrainians sow the seeds of re-emancipation all over Crimea, the southern Ukrainian front lines, and all the occupied territories, and the resistance still continues all over Ukraine from where it left off. The unexpected operation from Ukraine to the Crimean airbase. The Russian troops was taken aback by what happened. Putin, on the other hand, is practically surrounded. The Russian force in Crimea has nowhere to go with the indigenous people of Crimea also backing Ukraine. The Russian forces have started to withdraw. The Ukrainian army was caught off guard by its pullout. Russia began to consolidate many of the advantages obtained by Ukraine during the Ukrainian war. What Russia will do in response to the Ukrainian army's achievements astounds me. It is unclear what Russia will do following this operation in Crimea. However, due to the policies that Ukraine would implement in response, Russian attitudes have grown quite fearful. Despite the Russians' attempts to flee Crimea in fear, Putin did not allow it. The end of Russia is imminent. thanks to the pressure applied by the Ukrainian army. But the Crimeans have never reacted so strongly to Russia before. Russia's kingdom of fear in Crimea has crumbled with its new operation. It is the first time since Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014 that there has been such a big outpouring of rage against the occupying Russians. With the latest operation, Ukrainian soldiers who are aware of the situation have become a huge hope for the Crimeans. However, when Putin chose to begin a devious plot on this subject, everything became muddled. Putin's policies against the Crimeans within the context of the mammoth mobilization have sparked outrage around the world. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has indicated that he will not finish the war until Russia relinquishes control of Crimea. Russia's supremacy in this region has been brought to an end as a result of these debates. Owing to the robust actions of the Ukrainian army, this key airbase served all of the teams heading to the Ukrainian region. While bombing planes were also present, Russia's power in Crimea has been shaken by this circumstance. The Ukrainian troops discovered that the airbase had been pounding the area for a long period. Aircraft in this region were continually targeting the Ukrainian army and thwarting its plans. That is why the Ukrainian army dispatched flag officers to this area to gather intelligence. However, because many of the Bayraktars were destroyed by air defense systems as soon as they arrived in this vicinity, adequate intelligence could not be gathered in this manner. As a result, the Ukrainian army dispatched a special force to this location. Many benefits that Ukraine will enjoy have been generated specifically as a result of this union. However, this crew first planted a chip on one of the planes to determine the location of the airfield. While this explicitly revealed the location of the airbase, it also raised several questions regarding how an operation will be carried out in the mapped region. It was now time for the Ukrainian army to intervene. Ukrainian special forces were stationed in this area. Many munitions were handed to these men in order for it to be a simple operation. And these soldiers were transferred to a remote place from the Russian headquarters. Ukrainian special forces were meant to be the first to force Russian airplanes out of this area. This could have happened because the Bayraktars were working in a nearby location at the same time to assure the plane's departure. The flag officers began shelling one of the military offices in the region. The Russian army promptly dispatched fighter jets over the flag bearers after hearing this. When the flag officers got this information, they started retreating towards the Patriots' range. When the Ukrainian special forces realized there were no more planes or pilots in the region, they coordinated a fast operation and eliminated those at the airbase. He immediately took action to explode the Russian aircraft's explosives. The men who had carried a considerable quantity of SIFAs with them began to line up C4s in the Russian military headquarters ammo dumps. At the same time, the fighter jets chasing the flag officers began to retire in order to avoid coming into contact with them. Immediately following the air incident, Ukrainian special forces began returning to Ukraine to utilize remote-controlled bombs. When Ukrainian special forces pressed the control, the most critical airbase in this region was blown up. Following this occurrence, Russian warplanes were perplexed as to what to do because they had no idea where to land, because they didn't know what Ukraine was going to do. Russian jets on their approach to the nearest airbase also fell into a major trap in this region. The Patriots had been dispatched to this area. It had been decided that if the mission was carried out as planned, the Russian jets would begin to depart. Warplanes that came into range of the Patriots were shot down one by one. The jets delivering messages to the Kremlin were perplexed as to what to do. The Russian pilots who were preparing to jump from their jets faced a major dilemma. The Ukrainian army has once again demonstrated to the rest of the world the importance of simultaneous operations. However, at this point, two weapons allowed Ukraine to effectively exit the mission. The earliest of them were the flag officers, who provided excellent leadership to the Ukrainian air forces and bombers from the start. This issue has also been taken to an entirely different level with the last statement. Turkey made the stunning decision and announced the opening of a Bayraktar factory in Ukraine. While this event has far-reaching consequences around the world, it demonstrated to the entire world that Ukraine will now continue the war from a different position. Following the Bayraktars, Turkey moved quickly to reach a major deal on the Red Apples, which will be released as unmanned aircraft. This was the kind of situation where we could handle everything differently because the Russian army has been reduced to such a desperate state. Victory for the Ukrainian military is now deemed imminent. The long-range Patriots were another weapon that arrived in Ukraine and changed the course of the operation. Long-range Patriots. One of the weapons that the U.S. declared at the start of the war that it could not give fell into the hands of Ukraine as a result of Russia's destabilizing policies. This circumstance has now allowed the Ukrainian army to acquire distinct quality because Russia has a system that may threaten nuclear war in a variety of ways and fundamentally alter the peace climate. A global crisis has begun. Following this catastrophe, the Russian army currently faces numerous challenges. Because Russia suffered significant losses, particularly owing to patriotism. The topic of World War I was brought up again. However, because the entire world was alarmed by the situation, it began to act as a unified front against Russia. It is impossible to foresee what Russia, which is irritated that Ukraine has shifted to a more advantageous position as a result of the Patriots, would do right now. According to military strategists, Russia can pose big challenges in several sectors because Ukraine has both political and military success. These threats, on the other hand, dramatically undermine Russian trust while allowing Ukraine to adopt massive countermeasures. The Ukrainian army is growing stronger by the day thanks to its triumphs in foreign policy, and it has managed to rally the entire world behind it. Ukraine has progressed to a new level as a result of the numerous events that have occurred as a result of these achievements. It is impossible to foresee what Russia will do at this moment in Ukraine's history because if Russia does not win the conflict, Ukraine will remain a major regional power, and this will go down in history as Putin's bare minimum. Even the prospect of this frightens Putin, who is beginning to engage in increasingly confrontational actions as a result of his diminished influence. This demonstrates to everyone that Putin will bring Russia to its conclusion. Ukraine's maneuver was successful in repelling the Russian invaders. The largest convoy in Russian history has just been captured by Ukrainian soldiers. Russia's ammo scarcity on the battlefield has reached crisis proportions. With this operation, with the takeover of Ukrainian forces, Russian military retreated from the region in an unexpected move. The weapon deployed by Ukraine in this opera astounded the entire world press. Russia has just suffered back-to-back defeats on Ukrainian territory in the continuing Russian-Ukrainian war. The Russian army was greatly hampered as a result of the exponential escalation in these defeats. The Ukrainian army began to totally repel the Russian invaders from the territories they had taken. Putin is enraged by the situation and is at a loss for what to do. Ukrainian troops continued to strike massive and lethal blows to the Russian invaders. Russia's and Putin's misguided policies have swung the war completely in Ukraine's advantage. Putin, who has grown entirely alone in foreign policy, has threatened Western countries in his rage. As a result of recurrent setbacks, NATO responded to these threats by refusing to remain silent. Russia-Ukraine War No. 1. The year is coming to a conclusion, but the Russian invaders have made no advance on the fronts where fierce fighting is taking place. In addition to this failure, the Russian army, which had sustained enormous losses, had stayed unarmed throughout the last campaign against Ukrainian forces. Because of the arms shortage, fighting with Ukraine's other armaments has become impossible with Ukraine's latest blow. Even Russian servicemen who had secure headquarters withdrew. Russia's network of Mohammed given to the fronts is completely spread. The most recent operation undertaken by Ukrainian soldiers taught the globe how to do this. The fact that Russia had lately placed its military on the defense had created concern all throughout the world. Knowing this, the Ukrainian army dispatched Bayraktar unmanned aerial vehicles to location where Russian invaders had previously conducted attacks in order to offer intelligence. The intelligence provided by the Bayraktars is critical in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Bayraktar ensigns air vehicles, which played a significant part in practically every operation, also performed admirably in this one. Bayraktar ensign as air vehicles identified a significant intelligence gap in Russia during this patrol. This intelligence provided an excellent opportunity for the Ukrainian army. The route through which Russian forces transferred the required ammo and weapons to the men on the Ukrainian fronts was discovered during the reconnaissance fly. This route carried not just ammo and guns, but also everything a soldier or individual needed to survive. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Turkey has chosen a delicate balancing act that looks like a risky but overall successful strategy with interests on both sides. Ankara has consistently supported Ukraine politically and militarily without alienating Russia. Economically, Ukraine played a very important role in deterring the Kremlin's military buildup in the Black Sea, which also poses a threat to Turkey. Turkey has received praise from Ukraine and the West for its unequivocal refusal to recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. At the moment, the war in Ukraine has reached a stalemate, and neither side is expected to make major gains on the ground until the summer of 2023 at the earliest. The Kremlin's army is facing exhaustion in every sense and seems unable to stop a multi-pronged Ukrainian offensive. The Russian military might consider putting its power in the Black Sea to the fore in order to intimidate the Ukrainian forces. However, with Turkey closing the Black Sea to the Russian Navy cannot compensate for its losses. In this context, Ukraine's coastline, Black Sea power dominance, and the stance of Ukraine's ally Turkey are very important. Turkey's role is critical for both NATO and Ukraine at the operational and tactical levels. Turkey became the first country to declare Russia's move an act of war with Ukraine's decision to implement Article 19 of the Montreux Convention just 3 days after the invasion. Even more surprisingly, although the Montreux Convention gave the Kremlin the right to do so, Turkey also asked Russia not to recall the Black Sea Fleet ships located elsewhere. Between 20 and 30 ships belonging to the Russian Black Sea Fleet are thought to be elsewhere. 5 or 6 are caliber-capable platforms, and 2 of these are Kilo-class submarines. This forced Russia to send warships in need of maintenance after facing NATO in the Mediterranean to the Pacific, Baltic or Arctic instead of the Black Sea shipyards. The dominant NATO naval force in the Black Sea is Turkey, which has a very capable, well-balanced fleet, including frigates, mine layers, and submarines, as well as cutting-edge technology in using drones for a variety of missions. And as the Ukrainian air and seaplane attacks in recent months have shown, even Sebastopol, its home base in Crimea, is not safe today. The Russian Navy was forced to retreat to its main naval base at Novorossiysk, on the eastern shores of the Black Sea. Ankara's move signaled a firm commitment to upholding the Montreux Convention and are significantly hampering the Russian fleet in the long run. Unable to bring troops from other fronts, the Russian Navy became the hostage of the Black Sea rather than its master. The Russian Navy is trapped in the Black Sea. The Kremlin cannot replace Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet sunk by the Ukrainians in April 2022. Ankara's decision to close the Istanbul and Dardanelles Straits to Russian warships also helped prevent escalation in the Black Sea. The 1936 Montreux Convention, which regulates access to the Black Sea by sea, made Turkey a kind of guardian of the Black Sea. The convention only allows riparian states to maintain large and permanent navies in the Black Sea. Of these states, only Russia and Turkey have large navies, which makes the Black Sea a Russian-Turkish property compared to Monroe, Ukraine, which is the third largest country in the Black Sea region in terms of population and territory after Turkey, and Russia, and the fourth largest in terms of economy, occupies a particularly important place in Ankara's strategic thinking. Ankara has maintained good relations with Ukraine since Ukraine's independence in 1991, developing it as a key ally against Russia. Also, Turkey's decision to close the only access point to the Black Sea from the Mediterranean put a lot of pressure on the Russian Navy, with some ships having to go to the Pacific for vital care. UAV attacks by Ukrainian forces stripped Russia of its ability to operate west of the waterway. On a practical level, Turkey deploys a surface ship, a submarine, and a maritime patrol aircraft in the Black Sea around the clock. These assets provide 67% of NATO's recognized maritime picture in the region. The situational awareness, in the words of the alliance or feed in NATO language, Turkey also forms the backbone of NATO's mine-fighting capabilities to keep the Black Sea safe until Romania's efforts to modernize and expand its submarine and mine countermeasure capabilities bear fruit. NATO will continue to rely on Turkey for regional maritime situational awareness. The Turkish Navy also assumed command of the maritime component of the alliance's Very High Readiness Joint Task Force in June 2022. NATO membership is a strategic facilitator for Turkey, especially in terms of nuclear deterrence. From the beginning of its invasion of Ukraine, the sounds of Russian nuclear weapons strengthened the alliance's interest in Turkey's security. While other partners were hesitant about military assistance, Turkey became the first country to provide drones to Ukraine. On the other hand, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, maintaining close ties with Russian President Vladimir Putin, succeeded in positioning Turkey as an important mediator in the conflict and underlined his success in this balancing act. This personal relationship allowed him to bring the Russian leader to the negotiating table, albeit with little practical consequence for ending the war. Diplomatic agreements mediated by Turkey, such as the Grain Initiative or the Prisoner Exchange, have helped resolve pressing humanitarian issues. However, Ankara was unable to mediate a ceasefire or comprehensive peace talks. Above all, Erdogan's peace talks and food diplomacy have strengthened Turkey's standing in the region and far beyond, as it is known. Turkish Bayraktar TB2 unmanned aerial vehicles helped Ukraine in the first days of the war. Another important Turkish contribution to Ukraine's defense efforts is the continuation of the supply of Bayraktar TB2 UAVs. These drones played many highly visible roles in the early stages of the war, including distracting air defense assets while Moskva was on the water. Video footage from drones also helped Kiev's information campaign by creating a military success narrative. Turkey has declined to officially acknowledge the nature and amount of its military aid to Ukraine, but open-source data shows it supports the fight against Russia. Turkey's contributions are geared towards key capabilities, although the material may seem modest when compared to the warplanes and battle tanks supplied by other NATO members. According to the open-source intelligence portal Oryx, Turkey has supplied approximately 35 TB2 UAVs, 24 Bayraktar mini reconnaissance UAVs, 230 guided multiple rocket launchers, 200 BMC Kirpi, MRAP armored vehicles and mortars. Reportedly, 100,000 rounds of 155mm are currently ordered. According to unconfirmed reports, Turkey has already transferred locally produced cluster munitions defined as dual-purpose developed conventional munitions. Recently, 30 Turkish Otokar-made Cobra 2 4x4 wheeled armored personnel carriers were seen on a freight train in Romania en route to Ukraine. However, Turkey's role was eclipsed as other allies increased their military support to Ukraine and joined in coalitions around Kiev to send tanks and defend jets. Despite Turkey's status as the second-largest NATO army and Ankara's diplomatic ambitions to become a global power, it is not Turkey, but smaller countries such as Poland and the Baltic states that have been the most vocal and leading in denouncing Russia's war in Ukraine. On the other hand, one of the key issues in the Turkey-Ukraine-Russia triangle is the Black Sea Peninsula, Crimea. Turkey categorically rejects the annexation of Crimea. At the same time, Crimea holds the key to ending the Ukraine war. For this reason, the peninsula is at the center of attacks. A former U.S. lieutenant general claims that a Ukrainian counterattack, which includes a daring attempt to retake Crimea, will cause Russian troops to leave the field or collapse. The Crimean operation could be at the center of new offensive plans and promises to have far-reaching consequences. Vladimir Zelensky remains silent about how this could end up on the battlefield. But the Ukrainian president has been meeting with world leaders in recent weeks, possibly to increase military support. And retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, now the former commander of the U.S. Army. Europe has made a damning decision about Putin's chances of success against Ukraine in the coming weeks. Hodges warned that history has shown that over the years a force from various wars has suffered tremendous setbacks, or when its troops are not well trained, they often crack as a result. If there is a successful Ukrainian counterattack in the next few months, followed by major attacks all over Crimea, it is only a matter of time before the Russian troops leave the field.